There is an island in New York City that most New Yorkers have never seen up close, and that most visitors to the city never think to look for. It sits in the East River. In that wide stretch of water that separates the Bronx from the northern tip of Queens, close enough to the Bronx shoreline, that on a clear day you can make out the shapes of trees and the broken outlines of old brick buildings through the branches. The city moves around it, boats crossing the river plains, descending toward LaGuardia Airport, not far to the south, the constant ambient noise of one of the world's great metropolitan areas drifting across the water. But the island itself remains quiet, largely still. Separated from all of that movement by the river and by more than half a century of gradual patient abandonment, the island is called North Brother Island. It is not large, roughly 20 acres, about the size of a few city blocks, and it has no permanent residents, no regular ferry service, no open paths or public facilities. Access is restricted. The buildings that still stand on it are deteriorating, their windows long since broken, their interiors open to the weather, their foundations slowly yielding to the weight of vegetation that has been growing undisturbed for decades. The trees that once surrounded the hospital grounds have advanced across the lawns and courtyards and roadways, reclaiming the land in the patient, methodical way that living things reclaim abandoned spaces when human maintenance is withdrawn. And yet this small, quiet, overgrown island carries within it one of the most layered and historically significant stories in all of New York City's long and complicated history. It was, for many decades, a place of medicine and quarantine, a hospital island where patients with infectious diseases were separated from the city's population and treated, or simply held at the edge of the East River. It was connected to one of the greatest maritime disasters in American history, a catastrophe that took place in the waters just offshore on a summer morning in 1904, and that brought tragedy directly to the island's shores. And it was, for many years, the place where Mary Mallon, the woman who would become known to the world as Typhoid Mary, lived out a long, involuntary confinement, isolated from the city she had worked in, waiting for a resolution that never fully came. These stories deserve to be told carefully and in full because the popular versions of North Brother Island tend to emphasize the dramatic at the expense of the human. The eeriness of the abandoned buildings, the lurid nickname of its most famous patient. The ghost stories that accumulate around any place with a history of illness and death. The real history is more complicated and in some ways more moving than any of those simplified versions suggest. If you find yourself drawn to the quiet histories of forgotten places, to the stories that lie behind the surfaces of abandoned buildings and overgrown grounds, then this is a journey worth taking. And if you enjoy these long, slow explorations of American history, please consider subscribing to History Sleepy Time and sharing this documentary with someone who might appreciate it. These are stories made for quiet evenings and long, restful listening, and we are glad to have you here. Let us begin, then, where the island itself begins, in the geography of the river that holds it. To understand why North Brother Island became what it became, it is necessary to understand something about New York City in the decades before the modern era of public health, to understand the city not as it appears now. With its water treatment systems and its sanitation infrastructure and its hospitals and its centuries of accumulated medical knowledge, but as it appeared in the middle and late 19th century, when it was growing with extraordinary speed and when the consequences of that growth for human health were becoming increasingly impossible to ignore. New York City in the 19th century was one of the great destinations of the modern world. People came to it from every direction, from the farms and small towns of the American interior, from the ports of Ireland and Germany, and later from Southern and Eastern Europe, from the Caribbean, and from other parts of the Western Hemisphere. They came because New York was a port, because it was a center of commerce and manufacturing and opportunity, because it was the place where ships arrived from distant continents, and where the possibility of a better life seemed most immediately present. They came in enormous numbers, and the city grew to receive them in ways that the existing infrastructure was not always prepared to accommodate. The neighborhoods of Lower Manhattan in the mid-19th century were among the most densely populated places on Earth. Tenement buildings, constructed to house as many paying tenants as their floors and walls could physically contain, rose above narrow streets that were themselves crowded with the activity of a working city. Carts and horses and vendors and pedestrians, the debris of daily commerce. The waste products of animals and people and industry. Water came from sources that were not always safe. Drainage and waste removal were inadequate for the scale of the population they were meant to serve. The conditions that, in retrospect, we understand as ideal for the transmission of infectious disease were present in abundance. The diseases that moved through 19th century New York were the diseases of crowding and contamination. Typhoid fever spread through contaminated water and food cholera, which arrived in epidemic waves from other continents and moved with terrifying speed through populations without access to clean water. Smallpox, which could spread through the air, as well as through direct contact. Scarlet fever and diphtheria, which took a terrible toll, particularly among children. Tuberculosis, which spread in the close quarters of tenement living and became one of the greatest killers of the era. These were not rare or exotic diseases. They were the ordinary companions of urban life in the industrial age, present in every city of comparable size, accepted as an inevitable feature of city living, even as reformers and scientists and public health advocates worked to understand and address them. The medical understanding of disease in the early 19th century was significantly different from what it would become by the century's end. The germ theory of disease, the understanding that many illnesses are caused by microscopic organisms and that controlling their transmission requires controlling the organisms themselves, was not yet established as scientific consensus at the beginning of the 19th century. Older theories attributed disease to bad air, to miasmas rising from swamps and decomposing organic matter, to environmental conditions rather than to specific biological agents. These theories were not without consequence. They motivated improvements in ventilation and drainage that genuinely reduced disease transmission, even if the mechanism was misunderstood. But they could not provide the precise, targeted understanding of disease transmission that germ theory would eventually make possible. The work of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch in the 1860s through the 1880s established the microbial basis of many infectious diseases, and the gradual acceptance of germ theory through the medical community transformed the possibilities of public health intervention. If a disease was caused by a specific bacterium, and if that bacterium required specific conditions and pathways to reach new hosts, then interrupting those pathways through clean water, proper sewage disposal, careful food handling, and the isolation of infectious individuals, could in principle reduce or eliminate the disease. This was the scientific foundation on which the public health infrastructure of the late 19th and early 20th centuries was built. New York City was at the forefront of this transition. The city's health authorities were among the most active and sophisticated in the country, grappling with the scale of the public health challenge presented by a rapidly growing population of immigrants and urban workers in conditions of high density and inadequate sanitation. The Metropolitan Board of Health, established in 1866, was an early and influential public health institution, and its successor organizations developed increasingly sophisticated capacities for disease surveillance, investigation, and response over the following decades. The physical infrastructure of public health, the water systems, the sewers, the hospitals, was also developing through this period, though slowly and unevenly. The Croton Aqueduct, completed in 1842, brought relatively clean water from Westchester County to New York City for the first time, reducing but not eliminating the risk of waterborne disease. The expansion of the municipal water system over the following decades gradually extended the reach of cleaner water to more of the city's population. Sewage infrastructure developed more slowly, and the full implementation of systems that effectively separated waste from drinking water took many decades to achieve. It was in this context, a rapidly growing city grappling with infectious disease, developing new scientific understanding, building new institutions, and attempting to manage an unprecedented public health challenge, that North Brother Island came to play its particular role. The history of medical institutions on North Brother Island begins in 1885, when the city of New York opened Riverside Hospital on the island for the purpose of treating and isolating patients with smallpox and other infectious diseases. The island had been used informally in connection with disease isolation efforts before this date, but the establishment of Riverside Hospital as a formal institution marked the beginning of the island's long career as a dedicated medical facility. The choice of an island location for a quarantine and isolation hospital was not accidental, and it was not unique to New York. The use of islands for disease isolation had a long history in Western medicine and public health practice, rooted in the understanding, well established long before germ theory provided a precise explanation, that separating sick people from healthy populations could reduce the spread of disease. The word quarantine itself derives from the Italian quarantina, meaning a period of 40 days, referring to the practice of holding ships suspected of carrying disease at anchor for that period, before allowing their passengers and cargo to enter port. Island locations offered a natural barrier between the quarantined and the general population, the water of the surrounding river or harbor serving as a physical boundary that was more reliable than any fence or wall. New York Harbor and the East River already had a history of quarantine facilities before North Brother Island took on this role. Quarantine Island, as it was sometimes called, in New York Harbor had served isolation functions for arriving ships. The use of North Brother Island for hospital and isolation purposes reflected both the continuing need for such facilities and the city's evolving approach to managing infectious disease within its own population, not just at its maritime borders. Riverside Hospital, as it operated in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was primarily focused on smallpox, and later, a range of other infectious diseases including typhoid fever, tuberculosis, diphtheria, and scarlet fever. Patients were brought to the island by boat from various points on the Manhattan and Bronx shoreline, a journey that in rough weather or cold months could be uncomfortable, and that in all seasons marked a clear physical separation between the patient's ordinary life in the city and the institutional life that awaited them on the island. The hospital complex that developed on North Brother Island over the years included a range of buildings, patient wards, staff residences, administrative facilities, support structures. The physical layout of the hospital reflected both the practical requirements of a functioning medical institution and the specific needs of infectious disease management, the separation of patients with different conditions, the accommodation of staff who needed to live on or near the island because of the practical difficulties of regular commuting, and the maintenance of the basic infrastructure of daily life on a small island with no permanent civilian population other than the hospital community itself. What was daily life actually like on North Brother Island for those who worked and lived there? The historical record provides some details, though inevitably the texture of everyday experience is harder to recover than the institutional facts. Staff who lived on the island, and some did, particularly in the earlier decades, finding it more practical to reside on the island than to commute by boat, inhabited a world that was simultaneously very close to and very removed from the city that surrounded it. The Manhattan skyline was visible across the water. The sounds of river traffic and, later, of the city's growing industrial activity drifted across the East River on still days. But the island itself was quiet, its rhythms set by the hospital schedule rather than by the commercial and social life of the city. For patients, the experience of hospitalization on the island was shaped by the nature of their illness, the length of their stay, and the medical practices of the era. Some patients spent relatively brief periods on the island, long enough to be treated and to demonstrate that they were no longer infectious, before being discharged back to their ordinary lives. Others spent much longer periods, held either because their illness was severe and prolonged, or because the medical and public health authorities were uncertain about their status as potential sources of contagion. The experience of patients varied considerably, and it would be an oversimplification to describe all of them as imprisoned or as victims of an unjust system, even as it would be equally wrong to ignore the genuine coercive elements of quarantine as it was practiced. The logic of island quarantine was, in its essential structure, simple. The water creates a barrier, and the barrier protects the healthy from the sick. But the practice of quarantine involved complexities that the simple logic did not capture, and understanding those complexities is important to understanding what North Brother Island actually was and what it meant for the people who passed through it. Quarantine, in the strict historical sense, referred to the detention of people or ships suspected of carrying disease, even in the absence of confirmed illness, the precautionary separation of those who might be sick from those who were known to be healthy. Isolation, in the medical sense, referred to the separation of people who were confirmed to be ill from the general population. These two concepts, while related, were distinct, and the practices associated with them were not always clearly separated in the public health administration of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The legal and administrative authority for quarantine in New York City rested with the city's health department, which had broad powers under public health statutes to order the isolation of individuals believed to pose a risk to public health. These powers were not unlimited. They were subject to legal challenge and to political pressure, and their application was not always consistent, but they were substantial, and they gave health authorities significant ability to confine individuals without the ordinary due process protections that applied in criminal proceedings. This concentration of public health authority in administrative agencies with limited judicial oversight reflected the dominant thinking of the progressive era, the belief that scientific expertise applied through professional institutions was the most effective means of addressing complex social problems, and that the traditional legal protections designed for criminal justice were not always appropriate in a public health context. This thinking was not without its critics, even at the time, and the tension between public health authority and individual rights was a genuine and contested issue in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The physical separation provided by an island setting was particularly useful for smallpox, which was both highly contagious and, before widespread vaccination, capable of spreading rapidly through unimmunized populations. A patient with active smallpox on the island could not, simply by moving through ordinary social space, transmit the disease to people in the city. The river served as a naturally maintained distance that supplemented whatever nursing and medical measures were being applied on the island itself. For diseases with other transmission routes, the isolation provided by the island was less clearly necessary from a purely scientific standpoint, but the island facility was used for various conditions across its history. Partly because it was the available facility, and partly because the public health logic of physical separation had a momentum that extended beyond the strictly necessary. The history of quarantine practice at North Brother Island reflects the gradual refinement of understanding about which diseases actually required physical isolation, as opposed to less extreme public health measures, as medical science advanced through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The island's relationship with the surrounding city was mediated almost entirely by water and by the boats that crossed it. Supplies arrived by boat, patients arrived by boat, staff came and went by boat. The mail and newspapers that connected the island's residents to the broader world came by boat. This total dependence on water transportation gave the island a particular kind of institutional isolation that reinforced the medical isolation it was designed to provide. To leave North Brother Island without official permission was not simply a matter of walking out a door. It required access to a boat, the ability to navigate the river, and the determination to make the crossing despite the physical challenges and the institutional consequences. This was a significant fact for patients whose stay on the island was not voluntary, and some patients' stays were not voluntary. The island's geography served the coercive dimension of public health quarantine as effectively as it served the medical dimension. And this dual function, isolation for treatment and isolation as detention, was present in the island's history throughout its active years. Among the infectious diseases that shaped North Brother Island's history, several deserve particular attention, not because they are dramatic in the way that epidemic diseases are sometimes described in popular accounts, but because understanding them is essential to understanding the public health logic that drove the island's development and the decisions that were made there. Smallpox was the disease most closely associated with the island in its early decades. It is caused by the variola virus, which spreads primarily through respiratory droplets and through contact with the skin lesions it produces. Before effective vaccination was widely available, and before the vaccination programs that would eventually lead to the disease's global eradication in 1980, smallpox was one of the most feared infectious diseases in the world, highly contagious, disfiguring, and in some forms lethal. In 19th-century New York, smallpox outbreaks occurred periodically, and the city's health authorities maintained ongoing vaccination programs and isolation facilities to manage the disease. Riverside Hospital on North Brother Island served as one of the primary locations for smallpox patients during outbreaks in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Scarlet fever and diphtheria, both bacterial diseases primarily affecting children, were also treated and isolated at the island facility. Scarlet fever, caused by streptococcal bacteria, produced a characteristic rash and could cause serious complications, including kidney and heart damage in severe cases. Diphtheria, caused by Corynebacterium diphtheriae, produced a membrane in the throat that could obstruct breathing, and was a leading cause of childhood death in the pre-antibiotic era. The development of antitoxin treatment for diphtheria in the 1890s was one of the early triumphs of bacteriological medicine and contributed to the gradual change in how such diseases were managed, moving from primarily isolation-based approaches toward treatment-based approaches. Tuberculosis, the bacterial disease caused by Mycobacterium tuberculosis, was one of the greatest killers of the 19th and early 20th centuries, responsible for an enormous proportion of all deaths in industrialized cities. It spread through the air, primarily in enclosed spaces with poor ventilation, which made the crowded tenements of New York's working-class neighborhoods particularly conducive to its transmission. The management of tuberculosis was a major preoccupation of public health authorities throughout the period of North Brother Island's active medical use, and the island's facilities were involved in tuberculosis care at various points in its history. But it was typhoid fever, or more precisely, one particular case of typhoid fever and the woman at its center, that would eventually make North Brother Island more widely known than any of its other medical associations. To understand that case fully, it is necessary first to understand typhoid itself, what it is, how it spreads, and why it presented such a specific and difficult challenge to the public health authorities of early 20th century New York. Typhoid fever is caused by the bacterium Salmonella typhi. Unlike some other infectious diseases, it does not spread through the air. It spreads through the consumption of food or water contaminated with the feces of an infected person. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when water systems were not yet fully protected from sewage contamination, and when food handling standards were far less rigorous than they would later become, this fecal-oral transmission route was difficult to interrupt completely. Contaminated water was a major source of typhoid outbreaks. The establishment of effective water chlorination and filtration systems during the early 20th century produced dramatic reductions in typhoid incidence in cities that implemented them. But contaminated food was also a significant route of transmission, and this created a particular public health problem when the person handling and preparing the food was a carrier of the bacteria, infected with the organism, but not personally showing symptoms of the disease. The discovery that individuals could carry and transmit typhoid fever without being themselves ill was one of the significant findings of early 20th century bacteriology. Such asymptomatic carriers, as they came to be called, carried living bacteria in their bodies, most commonly in the gallbladder, where the bacteria could persist indefinitely, and shed those bacteria in their feces, potentially contaminating food and water without any visible sign of illness. This created a category of disease risk that was invisible in the ordinary social world. A person who appeared perfectly healthy but who could transmit a serious illness to the people around them, particularly if that person worked in food preparation. It was the intersection of typhoid fever, asymptomatic carriage, and food preparation work that would bring a woman named Mary Mallon to North Brother Island, and would transform the island's history in ways that no one involved could have fully anticipated. Before we reach Mary Mallon's story, it is worth lingering for a moment on the world that surrounded North Brother Island during the years of its active use, the world of the East River and of New York City at the turn of the 20th century, because this world gives context to everything that happened on the island and meaning to the isolation that the island was designed to enforce. The East River, despite its name, is not technically a river. It is a tidal strait, a body of water connecting Upper New York Bay to Long Island Sound, subject to tidal currents that flow in both directions depending on the state of the tide. These currents make the East River a more challenging waterway than its calm name suggests, and they shaped the practical realities of island life. The timing of boat crossings, the difficulty of navigation in certain conditions, the relationship between the island and the shorelines on either side of it. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the East River was one of the busiest stretches of water in the world. New York was the great port of the Atlantic seaboard, and the river was crowded with commercial traffic, barges carrying coal and grain and manufactured goods. Ferries carrying passengers between Manhattan and Brooklyn and Long Island tugboats, guiding larger vessels through the harbor, fishing boats, pleasure craft, and the varied working vessels of a port city at the height of its industrial age. The sounds of this traffic are the bells and whistles of steam-powered vessels, the creaking of wooden hulls, the shouts of river workers, would have been among the constant background sounds of life on North Brother Island, a continuous reminder of the busy world from which the island's patients were separated. The communities along the Bronx shoreline opposite North Brother Island were, in the late 19th century, in transition from the semi-rural landscape of an earlier era toward the dense urban development that would characterize the Bronx by the mid-20th century. The shoreline neighborhoods that lay across the narrow stretch of river from the island were working-class communities, populated by immigrant families, many of whom had come from Ireland, Germany, Italy, and Eastern Europe, engaged in the varied manual and industrial labor that sustained the city's economy. These were communities not entirely unlike the communities from which many of North Brother Island's patients came, communities of working people living in close quarters, exposed to the ordinary infectious diseases of urban life, and dependent on institutions like Riverside Hospital when illness struck. The experience of being brought to North Brother Island for quarantine or treatment was an experience of transition, of moving from the crowded, social, noisy world of the city to a place that was geographically close but experientially distant. The boat crossing itself, brief as it was, marked a threshold between two worlds. On one side of the water was the city with its familiar streets and neighbors and daily routines. On the other was the island with its hospital buildings and medical staff and institutional rhythms, and for some patients, the uncertainty of not knowing how long they would remain. For patients who recovered and were eventually discharged, the return crossing was presumably a moment of relief, the restoration of ordinary life after a period of institutional isolation. For those who did not recover, the island was the last place they knew. The hospital kept records of its patients, as institutions do, but the full human texture of those patients' lives, what they thought about during the long hours in the hospital wards, what they hoped for, what they missed about the city visible across the water, belongs to the interior life of individuals whose inner experiences were not preserved in institutional documents. It is tempting to fill this silence with imagined emotion, but doing so would not serve the historical integrity of their stories. What we can say based on the nature of the institution and the historical context is that quarantine and isolation were experienced differently by different people, that some patients accepted the necessity of their isolation as a reasonable public health measure, that others resented it as an imposition on their freedom, that still others were simply too ill to engage deeply with the politics of their situation, and that the experience of being separated from family and community by a body of water and an institutional authority was, for all its medical justification, a genuine form of social removal that had real human costs. And through all of this, through the daily routines of hospital life, the boat crossings, the changing of the seasons, the views of the city from the island's shore, the East River continued to flow in both directions, carrying its tides toward the harbor and back, indifferent to the particular human drama taking place on the small island in its midst. To understand the story of Mary Mallon, and to understand why the public health authorities of New York City made the decisions they made about her, it is necessary to understand typhoid fever not merely as a name, but as a biological and social reality. To understand what the disease actually did to the people who contracted it, how it moved through communities, and what the emerging science of bacteriology revealed about its transmission in the early years of the 20th century. Typhoid fever, caused by the bacterium Salmonella typhi, was one of the defining diseases of 19th-century urban life. In the era before clean municipal water supplies became standard, it was a persistent and widespread cause of illness and death across the cities of Europe and North America. Its symptoms developed gradually, beginning typically with fever, headache, and fatigue that might initially be confused with other common illnesses, progressing over 1 to 3 weeks to higher temperatures, abdominal pain, a characteristic rash of rose-colored spots on the torso, and in some cases, the serious complications that gave the disease its fearsome reputation, including intestinal hemorrhage and perforation, which could be fatal. The name typhoid reflected an older medical observation that the disease produced a state somewhat resembling typhus, a state of profound illness and altered mental status that distinguished it from milder febrile conditions. The route of typhoid's transmission was not understood with precision until the bacteriological work of the late 19th century made it possible to track the organism through environmental samples. Earlier observers had noticed correlations between typhoid outbreaks and contaminated water sources. John Snow's famous investigation of the Broad Street cholera outbreak in London in 1854, while focused on cholera rather than typhoid, had demonstrated the kind of epidemiological thinking that would eventually illuminate typhoid transmission as well. But the precise identification of Salmonella typhi as the causative organism and the detailed understanding of how it moved from one person to another through fecal contamination of water and food came through the bacteriological investigations of the late 19th century. What the bacteriological understanding of typhoid revealed over time was a picture of transmission that was in some ways more complicated than simple water contamination. Water was indeed the most common vehicle for large-scale typhoid outbreaks. A contaminated municipal water supply could produce hundreds or thousands of cases simultaneously. But typhoid could also spread through contaminated food, through raw shellfish grown in polluted water, and through the hands of food handlers who were themselves carrying the bacteria. The improvement of municipal water systems through filtration and chlorination, which proceeded across American cities in the first decades of the 20th century, produced dramatic reductions in typhoid incidence wherever it was implemented. But water system improvements alone did not eliminate typhoid entirely, because foodborne transmission remained a route of infection that clean water could not address. The concept of the asymptomatic carrier, the person who harbored Salmonella typhi in their body without experiencing active illness, was one of the significant developments in the epidemiology of typhoid in the early 20th century. It had been observed that some individuals who recovered from typhoid fever continued to shed the bacteria in their feces for weeks, months, or in some cases years after their apparent recovery. These chronic carriers, as they came to be called, could transmit the disease without showing any signs of illness themselves. They might feel entirely well, perform their normal activities, and have no reason to suspect that they posed any risk to others. And yet the bacteria living in their bodies, most commonly in the gallbladder, could be shed in ways that contaminated food and water. The proportion of typhoid patients who become chronic carriers is not large. Studies have suggested that somewhere between 1 and 5% of typhoid patients become long-term carriers, with women somewhat more likely than men to enter a chronic carrier state, possibly related to differences in gallbladder anatomy and the conditions that favor bacterial persistence. But in absolute numbers, in a large city with many typhoid cases, a meaningful number of chronic carriers existed in the population at any given time, and most of them had no way of knowing they were carriers and no particular reason to take precautions against transmitting the bacteria they carried. The identification and management of typhoid carriers became a significant public health concern in the early 20th century precisely because the carrier state represented a source of ongoing disease transmission that could not be addressed by the usual tools of epidemic control: cleaning up water, supplies, improving sanitation, and isolating visibly ill patients. A carrier was not visibly ill. A carrier could not be identified by simple observation. Identifying a carrier required laboratory testing, specifically the bacteriological examination of stool samples for the presence of Salmonella typhi, a technology that was available in the early 20th century, but that required deliberate investigation to apply. It was this technology and the epidemiological detective work that directed it that would eventually bring a young Irish immigrant named Mary Mallon to the attention of the New York City Department of Health, and that would set in motion a sequence of events whose consequences for Mary Mallon personally were profound, whose significance for the history of public health was considerable, and whose legacy in American cultural memory has outlasted nearly everything else associated with North Brother Island. Mary Mallon was born in Ireland in 1869 in County Tyrone, in a part of the country that had been shaped by generations of agricultural life and by the continuing consequences of the famine of the 1840s and the economic pressures that followed it. She emigrated to the United States, as so many Irish men and women did in the decades after the famine, arriving in New York sometime around 1883 or 1884, when she was in her early to mid-teens. The precise details of her early years in America are not fully documented, and what is known about her life before she came to public attention is limited. What is established is that Mary Mallon became a domestic cook, a skilled one by all accounts. In the social world of late 19th and early 20th century, New York, working as a cook for a wealthy household was skilled labor, relatively well compensated compared to many forms of domestic service. And Mary Mallon appears to have established a reputation that allowed her to find employment with prosperous families in Manhattan and in the summer resort communities of Long Island and other areas where wealthy New Yorkers spent the warmer months. The cooking work that Mary Mallon performed was, in the context of her time, entirely ordinary. She prepared meals for the families that employed her, managed kitchen operations, and provided the kind of skilled domestic labor that was central to the functioning of upper-middle-class and wealthy households in an era before restaurant delivery and prepared foods. There is no historical basis for the later popular image of Mary Mallon as a person who behaved carelessly or recklessly toward those around her. Contemporary accounts of those who employed her or knew her describe a competent, hard-working domestic employee, not a person with any visible reason for the catastrophic attention that eventually descended upon her life. The chain of events that would lead to Mary Mallon's eventual confinement on North Brother Island began in the summer of 1906, when a family named Warren, who had rented a house in Oyster Bay on Long Island, experienced an outbreak of typhoid fever. 6 of the 11 people in the household contracted the disease, a clustering that was unusual enough to attract the attention of health investigators. The owner of the property, concerned about the property's value and reputation, hired a sanitary engineer named George Soper to investigate the source of the outbreak. George Soper was a civil engineer with experience in sanitary engineering and epidemiology, and he conducted a methodical investigation of the possible sources of the Oyster Bay outbreak. He examined the water supply, the food sources, the sewage arrangements, and the history of the household. He could find no plausible environmental source, no contaminated water supply, no obvious food source that would account for the clustering of cases in this particular household. When he turned his attention to the household staff and discovered that the family had employed a new cook shortly before the outbreak began, and that this cook had subsequently left the household, Soper began to pursue a different kind of hypothesis. Tracing the employment history of the cook, Soper found a pattern that was striking. In household after household where this particular cook had worked, over a period of years, typhoid cases had appeared among the residents or staff, typically within weeks of the cook's arrival. The cook's name was Mary Mallon. Soper counted, in the cases he was able to trace, approximately 22 people who had contracted typhoid fever in households where Mary Mallon had worked, a number that, while involving some uncertainties of attribution, was substantial enough to support a hypothesis of a common source. The epidemiological logic was compelling. The connection between Mary Mallon's presence and the appearance of typhoid cases in multiple households across multiple years in different locations was unlikely to be coincidental. The bacteriological understanding of asymptomatic typhoid carriage provided a mechanism. Mary Mallon could be harboring Salmonella typhi in her body, shedding the bacteria without illness, and contaminating the food she prepared for the families who employed her. The specific vehicle of transmission was not definitively established. But investigators believed that a dessert food that Mary Mallon was known to prepare, a dish involving uncooked or lightly cooked ingredients, may have been a likely route, since cooking kills the bacteria and raw or lightly handled food preserves it. Soper attempted to approach Mary Mallon directly to explain his findings and request laboratory specimens, stool and urine samples that could be tested for the presence of the bacteria. The encounters between Soper and Mallon were, by his own account, difficult. Mary Mallon was understandably alarmed and resistant when a stranger appeared and told her that she was responsible for the typhoid cases in her former employer's households, that she carried a disease without knowing it, and that she needed to submit to medical testing. From her perspective, that of a healthy woman with no illness, no understanding of bacteriological carrier theory, and no reason to accept the word of an unfamiliar investigator about her supposed danger to others. The claims being made about her would have seemed extraordinary and deeply threatening. The full humanity of Mary Mallon's position in these early encounters is worth holding in mind. She was not a person with medical training. The concept of an asymptomatic bacterial carrier was not common knowledge in 1907. The idea that a healthy person could carry and transmit a disease, that the body could harbor illness without experiencing it, was a relatively new scientific concept. And there was no reason why a working-class Irish immigrant woman with no formal education in medicine should have been familiar with it or prepared to accept it readily when it was presented to her as the explanation for her supposed danger to others. The situation between George Soper and Mary Mallon did not resolve through voluntary cooperation. When Soper's private attempts to obtain laboratory specimens from Mallon failed, he brought his findings to the New York City Department of Health, and the department eventually sent its own investigators, including Dr. Sarah Josephine Baker, a physician who worked for the Department of Health, to approach Mallon at the household where she was then employed. The encounter that resulted in Mary Mallon's first apprehension in 1907 was, by the accounts of those present, a physical struggle. Mary Mallon resisted the investigators who came to take her, and the final detainment required multiple attempts and significant effort. She was taken by police and health department officials to a city hospital for examination, and laboratory testing of her stool samples confirmed the presence of Salmonella typhi in her body. She was, bacteriologically, a confirmed typhoid carrier. Following her initial examination and the confirmation of her carrier status, Mary Mallon was transferred to North Brother Island, where she was held in a small cottage on the hospital grounds. Her status there was ambiguous. She was not a prisoner in the legal sense, having committed no crime. But she was not free to leave the island without official permission, and the permission she sought for her release was repeatedly denied by the health authorities, who maintained that her return to the community, particularly if she continued working as a cook, would pose a genuine public health risk. The legal dimensions of Mary Mallon's confinement were contested. She was held not through criminal conviction, but through the administrative power of the city's public health authorities, the same power that allowed those authorities to quarantine individuals with infectious diseases. Now applied to an individual who was not ill, but who was adjudged to be a public health threat. Mary Mallon, with the assistance of a lawyer, challenged her confinement through the courts. A writ of habeas corpus was filed on her behalf in 1909, seeking her release on the grounds that her detention without criminal charge or conviction was unlawful. The New York courts that considered the habeas corpus petition ultimately upheld the authority of the health department to detain Mary Mallon. The legal reasoning reflected the dominant public health jurisprudence of the progressive era, that the state's interest in protecting the public from infectious disease was sufficient to justify reasonable restrictions on individual liberty, and that the administrative expertise of public health professionals should be given significant deference by courts in determining what restrictions were reasonable. This was a contested legal philosophy, not a self-evident truth, and critics of the decision argued that it gave health authorities sweeping powers with insufficient procedural protection for the individuals subject to those powers. Mary Mallon remained on North Brother Island for approximately 2 years and 10 months before she was released in 1910. The conditions of her release required her to report to the health department at regular intervals and to agree not to work as a cook or in any other food handling occupation. The health authorities believed that if Mary Mallon could be kept away from food preparation, the public health risk associated with her carrier status would be effectively managed without permanent confinement. For a period, the arrangement appeared to hold. Mary Mallon attempted to find other kinds of work. Laundry work was mentioned in contemporary accounts, but the available evidence suggests that the alternatives to cooking work were less well compensated and less suited to the skills she had developed over her career. The historical record of exactly what happened in the years between her 1910 release and her reappearance in the public health record is incomplete, but what is documented is that by approximately 1914 and 1915, Mary Mallon had returned to working as a cook, this time under a different name, Mary Brown. In 1915, a significant typhoid outbreak occurred at Sloan Maternity Hospital in Manhattan. A substantial number of cases appeared among staff and patients, and investigators tracing the source of the outbreak identified a cook who had recently been employed there. When that cook was located and identified, she was found to be Mary Mallon, the same individual who had been released from North Brother Island 5 years earlier, with the explicit condition that she not work in food preparation. The circumstances of the Sloan Hospital outbreak and the fact that Mary Mallon had returned to cooking under a different name in apparent violation of the conditions of her release transformed the public and institutional response to her situation. Where her first period of confinement had been controversial, generating sympathy for a healthy woman held without criminal charge, the second apprehension was received more harshly, both by health authorities and by the press. She was returned to North Brother Island, and this time the health authorities made clear that the confinement would be permanent or at least indefinite. No further release was offered or seriously considered. The question of why Mary Mallon returned to cooking work, in apparent defiance of the conditions of her release, is one that the historical record does not fully answer. The popular assumption has sometimes been that she was indifferent to the harm she caused, or that she disbelieved the science of her career status entirely. But a more careful reading of the available evidence suggests a more complicated picture. Mary Mallon maintained throughout her life that she did not accept the characterization of herself as a permanent danger to others, that the cooking work she performed was skilled, that other carriers of typhoid were not similarly confined, and that the singling out of her person for permanent isolation was unjust and disproportionate. This last point deserves serious attention because it was not without basis. Other typhoid carriers were known to exist in New York City. Health Department records from the period show that a number of individuals with confirmed carrier status were identified and managed without permanent confinement. The management of other carriers typically involved counseling, regular monitoring, and prohibitions on certain kinds of work, rather than indefinite institutional detention. The fact that Mary Mallon was subjected to a more extreme response than other identified carriers was noticed at the time and has been analyzed by historians since. With explanations offered that include her specific history of noncompliance, the public health authorities' assessment of her as particularly high risk and factors related to her class, ethnicity, and gender that may have influenced how her case was handled. These are complicated questions, and they do not admit simple answers. What can be said with confidence is that Mary Mallon was a real person, not a caricature, a working-class Irish immigrant woman who found herself at the intersection of emerging bacteriological science, expanding public health authority, and the specific social conditions of early 20th century New York. In a position that was genuinely unprecedented and that raised questions about individual rights and public health power that were not fully resolved by the courts or the medical establishment of her time. Mary Mallon's story has become, in retrospect, one of the most discussed cases in the ethics of public health, a case that raises questions that were live and contested in her own time, and that have continued to be examined by historians, legal scholars, medical ethicists, and public health practitioners ever since. The fundamental tension in her case was between two legitimate principles that pointed in different directions. On one side was the principle of public health protection, The understanding that a typhoid carrier working as a cook posed a genuine risk of transmitting a serious illness to the people who ate the food she prepared, and that the state had both the authority and the responsibility to prevent that transmission. On the other side was the principle of individual liberty, the understanding that a person who had committed no crime should not be subject to indefinite confinement without conviction, without clear legal process, and without the kind of periodic review and opportunity for release that are considered basic requirements of just detention. In Mary Mallon's time, the balance between these principles in American public health law tilted heavily toward public health authority. The courts that reviewed her case applied a deferential standard to the judgments of health department professionals, accepting their assessment of the risk she posed and their determination that confinement was the appropriate response. The legal and administrative framework did not provide strong procedural protections for individuals subjected to public health detention, and the political climate of the progressive era was broadly supportive of expert institutional authority in the management of complex social problems. From the perspective of the early 21st century, when the ethics of quarantine and isolation have been extensively analyzed in light of modern human rights frameworks and public health experience, the treatment of Mary Mallon looks considerably more problematic. The indefinite nature of her second confinement, more than 23 years from her second apprehension in 1915 until her death in 1938, without periodic review, without meaningful opportunity for release, and without the kind of due process protections that modern law would require for such prolonged detention, is difficult to reconcile with contemporary standards of justice, even granting the reality of the public health concern. There is also the question of proportionality and consistency. The number of typhoid cases that can be reliably attributed to Mary Mallon's carrier status is a matter of some historical uncertainty. Soper's original count of 22 cases has been discussed and analyzed by later historians, who have noted that the attribution of specific cases to a specific carrier is subject to epidemiological uncertainty. The death toll directly attributable to her is generally assessed as relatively small. 3 deaths are often cited in the historical literature, though again, attribution in historical cases of this kind involves uncertainty. This is not to minimize the significance of any individual's death from a preventable illness, but to note that the harm attributed to Mary Mallon, while real, was not on the scale that the extreme response of permanent confinement would seem designed to address. Other typhoid carriers of the era, including some who were identified as having caused more deaths than were attributed to Mallon, were managed without permanent confinement. This disparity in treatment raises questions about whether factors beyond pure public health calculus, Mary Mallon's gender, her class status, her ethnicity as an Irish immigrant, her non-compliance with health department directives, and the intense media attention that her case attracted, played a role in determining the severity of her treatment. The nickname Typhoid Mary deserves particular examination, because it is one of the most enduring legacies of the case and one of the most revealing of how the public discourse around Mary Mallon operated. The nickname was a creation of the press. It appeared in newspaper coverage of her case beginning around 1907 and 1908, and it served the function that nicknames of this kind often serve in public discourse. It reduced a complex human being to a single threatening characteristic, making her legible as a symbol of danger, while obscuring the individual person behind the label. Mary Mallon herself reportedly hated the nickname, and her resistance to it was, in some sense, a resistance to the reduction of her identity to her medical status, to the insistence that she was, above all else, a source of disease rather than a person. Whether one evaluates her behavior sympathetically or critically, the imposition of the Typhoid Mary identity was a form of dehumanization that served the interests of a public discourse, seeking clear villains and simple narratives more than it served the interests of accurate understanding. Mary Mallon spent the final years of her life on North Brother Island, where she worked in the hospital laboratory and in other capacities, a fact that is sometimes noted in historical accounts as evidence that she was not entirely isolated from purposeful activity. She suffered a stroke in 1932, which left her partially paralyzed, and she spent the last 6 years of her life in a bed in the island's hospital. She died on November 11, 1938, at an age that was approximately 69 years, having spent more than 26 of those years on North Brother Island. She was buried in St. Raymond's Cemetery in the Bronx. The story of Mary Mallon is, ultimately, a story about what happens when individual lives intersect with the mechanisms of institutional power in a moment when both scientific knowledge and legal frameworks are incomplete and contested. It does not have a clean moral. It does not yield easily to either of the simplified versions. The version in which she was a reckless villain who deserved her fate, or the version in which she was simply an innocent victim of an unjust system. She was a real person, living in a real historical moment, caught between forces that were larger than any single individual could fully navigate, and the complexity of her situation deserves to be held with the care and attention it warrants. On the morning of June 15, 1904, a steamboat called the General Slocum left a pier on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, carrying more than 1,000 passengers on an excursion trip up the East River. The passengers were members and friends of St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church, a congregation based in the Kleindeutschland neighborhood, the German immigrant quarter of the Lower East Side, and the trip was an annual church outing, a summer excursion of the kind that was a common social event for New York's immigrant communities in that era. The General Slocum was a large sidewheel paddle steamer, more than 200 feet in length, operated by the Knickerbocker Steamboat Company. It had been in service on New York waters since 1891 and had carried excursion passengers many times before. The majority of the passengers on June 15, 1904, were women and children, mothers and their children, grandmothers, young women, girls and boys in their summer clothes, gathered for what should have been a pleasant day on the water. The German American community of Kleindeutschland was, by the early 20th century, one of the most established immigrant communities in New York. The neighborhood, centered around the streets of the Lower East Side, between roughly 7th Street and 14th Street on the east side of Manhattan, had been a predominantly German-speaking enclave since the mid-19th century. The residents of Kleindeutschland had built churches, schools, social clubs, and commercial establishments that supported a community life conducted substantially in German, maintaining cultural connections to the homeland while building new lives in America. St. Mark's Lutheran Church was one of the central institutions of this community, and its annual excursion was one of the social highlights of the year for its congregants. The disaster began while General Slocum was making its way up the East River, approximately level with the area of East 90th Street in Manhattan. Fire was reported in the forward section of the vessel, in an area where flammable materials were stored, and the fire spread with extraordinary speed across the wooden vessel's decks and superstructure. The circumstances that transformed a manageable fire into a catastrophe have been extensively analyzed in the investigations that followed the disaster. The fire hoses and life preservers on board were found to be defective or inadequate life preservers that had been stored unused for years, crumbled in the hands of those who tried to use them, filled not with functional cork, but with granular material that provided no buoyancy. Fire hoses burst when water pressure was applied. The boat did not stop immediately, but continued moving up the river as the fire spread, the movement fanning the flames across the decks. Captain William Van Schaik's decision not to beach the vessel immediately on the Manhattan shore, but to continue toward North Brother Island, which he apparently believed offered a more suitable landing, has been extensively debated in historical and legal accounts of the disaster. Whether an immediate turn toward the Manhattan shore could have saved more lives, given the speed of the fire's spread and the condition of the safety equipment, is a question that cannot be definitively answered. What is certain is that by the time the General Slocum reached the vicinity of North Brother Island, the vessel was burning extensively and the passengers were in desperate straits. Passengers who jumped into the river faced the combined challenges of the East River current, the inadequate life preservers, and the fact that many of the women and children who constituted the majority of the passenger list could not swim. The river in this section is not calm. The currents and the churning water around a moving vessel created conditions in which even a strong swimmer would have struggled, and many of the passengers had no swimming ability at all. The staff of Riverside Hospital on North Brother Island were among the first organized responders to the General Slocum disaster, and the proximity of the hospital to the site of the burning vessel meant that the island became an immediate focal point of the rescue and recovery effort. When the burning steamer came into view of the island and its passengers began entering the water, hospital staff, nurses, doctors, orderlies, and other workers moved toward the island's shoreline to assist survivors who were reaching or being brought to the island. The boats available on the island were pressed into service for rescue operations. Contemporary accounts describe the hospital's staff working to pull survivors from the water and to provide immediate medical care to those who had been burned, who had swallowed water, or who were suffering from shock and exposure. The scale of the disaster quickly exceeded the capacity of the small hospital facility to manage alone. Rescue vessels from various points along the East River, police boats, tugboats, private craft, converged on the scene. Survivors were brought to multiple locations along the shoreline and were transporting to various hospitals across the city. North Brother Island received a significant number of the initial survivors and of the bodies of those who had not survived. The death toll from the General Slocum disaster was enormous. Contemporary estimates placed the number of deaths at more than 1,000 people. The precise figure varies in different historical accounts, but the consensus is that somewhere between 1,021 and 1,030 individuals, the vast majority of them women and children, perished in the disaster. It remains one of the deadliest disasters in New York City's history, a fact that is less widely remembered than it deserves to be, perhaps because the fire of 1904 was followed less than 7 years later by the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911. Another catastrophic loss of life that drew sustained historical attention. The impact of the General Slocum disaster on the German-American community of Kleindeutschland was devastating in ways that extended far beyond the immediate loss of life. The disaster killed a substantial portion of the female population of the neighborhood, the women and children who had gone on the church outing while many of the men remained working. Families were shattered. Streets that had been filled with the lives of specific families became, after June 15, streets marked by absence. Contemporary accounts describe the neighborhood as transformed by collective grief. The same streets, the same buildings, the same church, but irreversibly changed by the loss of so many of its members. In the longer term, historians have noted that the General Slocum disaster accelerated the dispersal of the Kleindeutschland community, that the association of the neighborhood with the grief of the disaster, combined with the ongoing pattern of German-American residents moving to newer neighborhoods in Upper Manhattan and the Bronx, effectively dissolved the geographic concentration of German-American life on the Lower East Side within a relatively short period. The neighborhood that had been Kleindeutschland became, over the following decade, a new destination for Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, and the German cultural character of the streets that had been maintained for half a century faded with the departure of its community. The General Slocum disaster did not cause this dispersal alone. It was part of a larger pattern of immigrant community movement within New York City. But the trauma of the disaster played a role in loosening the ties that had held the community to its particular piece of the Lower East Side. The legal aftermath of the disaster included the prosecution of Captain Van Schaik for criminal negligence and manslaughter. He was convicted and sentenced to 10 years of hard labor at Sing Sing prison. He served 3 years and 4 months before receiving a presidential pardon. The officers of the Knickerbocker Steamboat Company faced lesser consequences, and the regulatory reforms that were eventually implemented in response to the disaster addressed the specific safety failures, the inadequate life preservers and fire hoses that had been identified as contributing factors. For North Brother Island, the General Slocum disaster became a permanent part of the island's historical identity. The island had been a place of medical isolation and quarantine, of carefully managed separation between the sick and the healthy, and suddenly it had become the site of a chaotic, massive traumatic maritime disaster, a place where bodies were brought ashore, and where the limits of any institution's capacity to respond to sudden catastrophe were dramatically exposed. The two identities, the controlled medical institution and the improvised disaster site, sat uneasily together in the island's history, each illuminating something different about what the island was and what it meant in the larger life of New York City. The grave of some of the General Slocum victims lie in Lutheran Cemetery in Queens and in other cemeteries across the city, including a monument in Tompkins Square Park in Manhattan that commemorates the disaster. The island itself, where some of the first rescue efforts took place and where some of the dead were initially brought, carries no formal memorial. The history of that June morning exists in the records and in the memory of the descendants of the families who lost so much, carried forward not in stone on the island's shore, but in the more fragile medium of family history and historical documentation. The summer of 1904 passed over North Brother Island and over the city around it in the way that summers pass, with the gradual return of ordinary routine after the shock of extraordinary events. The General Slocum disaster had brought the island into sudden dramatic public attention, had tested the capacity of its hospital staff, beyond anything the institution had been designed to handle, and had deposited in the space of a single morning more grief and more death on those small shores than the island's medical staff would have encountered in months of normal operation. And then, as disasters do, it receded from the center of daily life, while remaining permanently in the memory of those who had experienced it, and in the historical record that preserved its consequences. Riverside Hospital continued to function after June 1904, returning to its primary purpose of treating and isolating patients with infectious diseases. The staff who had responded to the General Slocum disaster continued their work. The nurses who had pulled survivors from the water went back to tending patients in the wards, the doctors who had treated the burned, and the waterlogged returned to diagnosing and prescribing. The administrators who had coordinated the chaotic response to the steamer's wreckage returned to managing the institutional routines that kept a hospital running from day to day. Life on the island resumed its characteristic rhythms, shaped by the medical schedule rather than by the noise and movement of the city across the water. But the disaster had changed something in how North Brother Island was perceived by the city around it. Before June 15, 1904, the island had been largely invisible to most New Yorkers, a place they might know existed in a general way, a medical facility somewhere on the East River, not something that touched their daily lives or occupied their imaginations. After the disaster, the island had a different kind of presence in public awareness. It was now a place associated with a specific event, with a morning of fire and drowning and grief, with rescue efforts and recovery of the dead, with the terrible losses of a community that many New Yorkers knew and some had personal connections with. The island had acquired a weight of association that it had not previously carried. This association would prove persistent. In the years and decades that followed, North Brother Island would accumulate further layers of history, further patients, further institutional developments, further changes in the medical and social landscape that shaped what the island was and what it was for. But the General Slocum disaster remained one of the deepest marks in the island's historical identity, a connection that was never entirely absent from how the island was understood by those who knew its history. In the years immediately following 1904, Riverside Hospital continued to receive patients with the full range of infectious diseases that had always constituted its caseload. Smallpox patients arrived during the periodic outbreaks that continued to affect New York's population, though the scale of these outbreaks was gradually diminishing as vaccination became more widely practiced and accepted. Typhoid patients arrived from the city's neighborhoods, and the investigation and management of typhoid carriers became an increasingly significant part of the health department's activities through the first decade of the 20th century, activities that would eventually lead to the arrival of the island's most famous patient. The physical infrastructure of the island continued to develop during this period. Additional buildings were constructed to expand the hospital's capacity and to accommodate the various functions of an institution that served both as a place of treatment and as a place of enforced isolation. Staff facilities were improved. The connection between the island and the mainland shoreline was maintained through the boat service that was the island's lifeline. The institutional character of North Brother Island as a specialized, isolated, publicly operated medical facility was solidifying into a form that would persist for another half-century. What was the quality of medical care provided at Riverside Hospital during this period? The historical record suggests an institution that, within the limits of the medical knowledge and resources of its era, was functioning as a genuine hospital rather than as a purely punitive confinement facility. Doctors and nurses on the island were medical professionals engaged in the practice of medicine as it was understood in the early 20th century, applying the treatments available to them, monitoring patients' conditions, and, where possible, facilitating recovery and discharge. The island was not a comfortable place, and the isolation it imposed on patients was real and sometimes painful, but it was not, by the standards of its time, a neglectful or deliberately cruel institution. This is an important distinction to make, because popular accounts of North Brother Island sometimes describe it in terms that blur the line between a medical institution and a prison. The reality was more complicated. Quarantine and isolation did involve elements of coercion. Patients were held against their will, movement was restricted, the authority of the health department was enforced on the island as it was enforced through the legal framework of public health regulation. But within those coercive boundaries, the institution operated with medical intentions and, in many cases, with genuine care for the welfare of the patients in its charge. The doctors and nurses who worked on the island were not jailers. They were medical professionals operating within an institutional framework that combined treatment with confinement in ways that reflected both the public health logic of their time and the limitations of that logic. The first decades of the 20th century were a period of extraordinary transformation in medicine and public health, and the changes that occurred during this period had profound implications for the kind of work that North Brother Island was designed to do. The germ theory of disease, which had been established as scientific consensus by the 1890s, continued to generate practical consequences for medicine throughout the early 20th century. The identification of specific bacterial causes for specific diseases had made possible the development of specific diagnostic tests. The bacteriological examination of blood, stool, and other biological specimens for the presence of particular organisms. It had also made possible the development of specific treatments, antitoxins, and later vaccines that could prevent or moderate the effects of particular infections, and eventually in the 1930s and 1940s. The discovery of antibiotics that could directly kill the bacteria responsible for many of the most serious infectious diseases. The development of effective vaccines had particular implications for the management of diseases like smallpox, which had been one of North Brother Island's primary concerns in its early decades. Smallpox vaccination had existed since Edward Jenner's foundational work at the end of the 18th century, but the widespread implementation of mandatory vaccination programs and the development of more reliable and standardized vaccine preparations was largely a product of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As vaccination coverage in New York City expanded, the frequency and scale of smallpox outbreaks diminished, and with them, the demand for the island's smallpox isolation capacity. Similar patterns applied to other diseases. The diphtheria antitoxin, developed in the 1890s, transformed diphtheria from a frequently fatal childhood illness into a condition that could be effectively treated, reducing the need for long-term isolation of diphtheria patients. Improved sanitation and water treatment dramatically reduced typhoid fever incidence in New York and other major American cities during the first decades of the 20th century. The chlorination of New York City's water supply, which was extended during this period, produced reductions in waterborne disease transmission that no amount of isolation and quarantine could have matched. Scarlet fever, while remaining a significant illness, was gradually better understood and more effectively managed through the era. These changes in the disease landscape of New York City did not eliminate the need for Riverside Hospital immediately or all at once. The hospital continued to receive patients through the first decades of the 20th century, managing the ongoing caseload of infectious disease in a large city and providing the isolation capacity that the health department's public health mandate required. But the trajectory was clear. As the specific diseases that the island had been designed to manage became less common and better managed through other means, the institutional rationale for a dedicated isolation hospital on an East River island became progressively less compelling. The broader transformation of the American hospital system during the early 20th century also affected North Brother Island's situation. The hospital as an institution was itself changing, from a place associated primarily with the poor and the chronically ill, where people went when they had no other options, toward a place that was the central site of sophisticated modern medical care for patients of all social backgrounds. The development of sterile surgical technique, anesthesia, laboratory diagnosis, and eventually the full array of modern medical technology transformed what hospitals could do and how they were perceived by the public. Within this changing hospital landscape, a small isolation facility on an island in the East River occupied an increasingly specialized and peripheral position. The First World War brought additional demands on American medical institutions and redirected resources and attention in ways that affected facilities across the country. The influenza pandemic of 1918 and 1919, one of the most catastrophic infectious disease events in recorded history, killing somewhere between 50 and 100 million people worldwide, placed enormous pressure on public health and medical infrastructure across the United States. North Brother Island was part of the broader system of New York City's medical response to the pandemic, as facilities of all kinds were pressed into service to manage the overwhelming number of cases. The pandemic demonstrated both the extraordinary destructive capacity of infectious disease and the limitations of isolation and quarantine as responses to a pathogen that spread with the speed and geographic reach of the 1918 influenza strain. After the immediate crisis of the pandemic receded, the medical and public health world continued its gradual transformation. The interwar years brought further development of vaccine technology, continued improvement in sanitation and water treatment, and the beginning of the era of sulfonamide drugs, the first antibiotics developed in the 1930s that would eventually transform the management of bacterial infectious diseases. Each of these developments further reduced the specific niche that an island isolation hospital had occupied in the public health system of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The island's role continued to evolve in response to these changes. And it was during this middle period of the island's history that it was used for purposes that reflected the shifting priorities of New York City's institutional landscape, purposes that went beyond the infectious disease isolation that had originally defined the island's function. The period between the two world wars brought significant changes to the institutional character of North Brother Island. As the original rationale for the island, the management and isolation of patients with epidemic infectious diseases became less pressing in the face of medical advances and improved public health infrastructure. The island's facilities were adapted for other uses that reflected the social and institutional priorities of New York City in the 1920s and 1930s. One significant development was the use of the island's facilities in connection with tuberculosis care. Tuberculosis, caused by Mycobacterium tuberculosis, and spread through respiratory droplets in enclosed, poorly ventilated spaces, remained a major public health concern well into the 20th century, despite growing understanding of its causation and transmission. The management of tuberculosis patients often involved extended periods of rest and isolation, based on the understanding that reducing activity and separating patients from the general population could slow the disease's progression and limit its spread. Sanatorium-style treatment, in which patients were housed in dedicated facilities, often in rural or semi-rural settings with good air quality, was the dominant approach to tuberculosis management through the first half of the 20th century. North Brother Island, with its relative separation from the dense urban environment and its existing medical infrastructure, was used in connection with tuberculosis care during certain periods of its history. The specific institutional arrangements varied over time, and the historical record of exactly how the island's tuberculosis-related functions were organized and staffed is not entirely complete. What is clear is that the island continued to serve medical functions, though the specific character of those functions shifted as the disease landscape and institutional priorities of New York City changed. The Depression years of the 1930s brought financial pressures to public institutions across the city, and North Brother Island was not immune to these pressures. The maintenance of an island facility, with its inherent logistical costs, related to transportation, the physical challenges of keeping aging buildings in good repair, and the staffing requirements of a facility that could not draw on the casual labor that a mainland location might offer, was an ongoing expense that became harder to justify as the island's medical role became less distinctive. Mary Mallon's final years on the island fell in this period. She had suffered her stroke in 1932 and was bedridden for the remaining 6 years of her life, receiving care in the hospital's facilities until her death in November 1938. Her presence on the island during these final years was a quiet and diminished version of the charged and controversial presence she had represented during the years of her active confinement. She was an elderly, ill woman being cared for in a medical facility, not the public health threat who had generated years of newspaper coverage and legal controversy. Her death in 1938 was reported in the press, with obituaries that revisited the familiar narrative of Typhoid Mary, but the story had lost much of the urgency it had once carried. The world of 1938 was preoccupied with very different concerns. After Mary Mallon's death, the island continued in medical use for a few more years, but the trajectory was increasingly clearly toward closure. The Second World War created its own disruptions and demands on institutional resources, and the post-war period brought a reconsideration of many of the public facilities and institutional arrangements that had been established in earlier decades. The most unusual chapter of the island's post-war history was its use. In the late 1940s and into the 1950s, as a housing facility for young men who were receiving drug addiction treatment, specifically individuals being treated for heroin addiction, which had become a significant social concern in New York City in the post-war years. The use of North Brother Island as a site for drug rehabilitation represented a significant departure from the island's original infectious disease focus and reflected the adaptation of an existing institutional resource to a new social problem. The drug rehabilitation program on the island has been described in various accounts as troubled, hampered by the isolation of the island itself, which made therapeutic programming and the maintenance of connections to the outside world difficult by the institutional challenges of managing a population that was, in many cases, not voluntarily seeking treatment, and by the broader limitations of the treatment approaches available for addiction in that era. The program was eventually discontinued, and by the early 1960s, North Brother Island had ceased to function as an active institutional facility. The closure of the island's last program left the physical infrastructure of North Brother Island, the hospital buildings, the staff residences, the roads and pathways, the docks and service facilities, standing empty, with no ongoing human population to maintain them. And from that point forward, a different kind of history began, the history not of what was built and operated on the island, but of what happened to the island and its buildings when human maintenance was withdrawn and the natural processes of a river island were allowed to proceed undisturbed. The abandonment of North Brother Island in the early 1960s was not a dramatic event. There was no single day on which the last person left and the gates closed, and the island was formally surrendered to time and nature. The process was more gradual than that, a winding down of activity, a reduction of staff, a cessation of the boat service that had been the island's lifeline, and then, eventually, the simple absence of the human presence that had characterized the island for nearly 80 years. The buildings that remained on the island as it was abandoned were substantial. The hospital complex included patient wards, administrative buildings, a nurse's residence, doctors' quarters, utility structures, and various support facilities, a collection of brick and stone structures that had been built to last and that, absent active maintenance, would deteriorate in the manner of all structures exposed to the variable climate of the northeastern coast. The East River is not a gentle environment for buildings. The salt air, the moisture, the freeze-thaw cycles of northeastern winters, the occasional storm surges and flooding that accompany major weather events, all work steadily against the integrity of brick, mortar, metal, and wood. In the first years after abandonment, the buildings retained much of their structural integrity. Roofs were intact, walls were standing. The interiors, though emptied of furniture and equipment and the human activity that had once filled them, were still protected from the weather. But without the ongoing maintenance that any building requires, the replacement of damaged roofing, the management of drainage, the repair of windows and doors, the clearing of vegetation from foundations and walls, a deterioration begins, and once begun, it accelerates. The specific sequence of deterioration at North Brother Island has not been comprehensively documented in the historical record, because the island was not a subject of systematic observation during the early decades of its abandonment. Access was restricted, and the people who might have documented the island's changing condition, journalists, photographers, researchers, were not generally visiting it. What can be said based on accounts from various points in the post-abandonment period and on the photographic record that exists of the island's current condition, is that the deterioration proceeded in the manner characteristic of abandoned buildings in a moist variable climate, roofs failing water entering interior structures, weakening vegetation, advancing. The windows of the hospital buildings, once broken, admitted not only weather, but also the birds, bats, and small animals that inhabit abandoned structures. Plants established themselves in cracks in walls and foundations, their roots gradually working into the mortar and widening the fissures through which water could enter. Vines grew up the exterior walls of the buildings, eventually covering them in a living layer that, while providing some protection against direct rainfall, also held moisture against the brick and contributed to the long-term deterioration of the masonry. The interior spaces of the abandoned hospital buildings gradually became a different kind of environment from what they had been when occupied. The long corridors that had carried nurses and patients and medical staff became passages for wind and wildlife. The patient wards where generations of sick New Yorkers had lain in hospital beds became rooms open to the sky in places where roofs had failed, their floors covered by fallen plaster, broken glass, decaying wood, and the accumulated debris of decades of natural processes. The administrative offices and staff quarters lost their human scale, the arrangement of a desk, a chair, a filing cabinet, a window looking out over the river, and became simply deteriorating rectangular spaces, their original purpose legible only in the outlines of what remained. This quality of legibility, the ability to read the former purpose of a space from the surviving physical evidence, is part of what makes the abandoned buildings of North Brother Island both photogenic and historically significant. Unlike a landscape that has been fully cleared and returned to undifferentiated nature, the island's buildings retain enough of their original character to suggest the institution they once were, to evoke for a viewer who knows something of the history, the specific kind of human activity that took place within them. The remains speak to those who know how to listen, but the buildings were not speaking to many listeners during the early decades of their abandonment. The island sat in the East River, its restricted access ensuring that the deterioration proceeded largely without witnesses, the vegetation advancing season by season across grounds that had once been maintained as the proper environment for a working hospital. The vegetation that has established itself on North Brother Island since the early 1960s is not the original vegetation of the place. Before the development of the hospital complex, North Brother Island was a relatively low-lying piece of land in the East River, subject to tidal flooding in its lower areas, and covered with the kind of vegetation typical of a northeastern coastal island. Grasses, shrubs, and some trees shaped by the exposure to salt air and the periodic inundation that characterized the island's natural hydrological regime. The construction of the hospital complex modified the island's topography, grading and filling in ways that raised the elevation of parts of the island and created the level surfaces needed for buildings and roads. When the human management of the island ceased, The vegetation that established itself was the vegetation that colonizes disturbed ground in the northeastern United States, opportunistic pioneer species that are adapted to moving into areas where the existing vegetation has been removed or disrupted, and that prepare the ground over time for the establishment of more permanent plant communities. Trees of heaven, Ailanthus altissima, the tenacious urban tree that can grow through pavement cracks and in rubble, were among the early colonizers, as they are in many disturbed urban environments throughout the northeastern United States. Various shrub species established themselves across the former lawns and roadways. Vines grew rapidly over structures, trellising themselves on whatever offered support. Over the decades, as the pioneer vegetation gave way to more established plant communities, a genuine woodland developed across much of the island. Trees that had begun as seedlings in the 1960s and 1970s grew to substantial size by the first decades of the 21st century, their canopies closing over the former hospital grounds and creating a shaded understory beneath which a ground flora of shade-tolerant plants established itself. The overall effect, viewed from the water or from aerial photography, is of a small island almost entirely covered by forest, an unlikely woodland sitting in one of the most heavily urbanized river systems in the world, surrounded by the traffic of the East River and the skyline of a city of 8 million people. This visual contrast, dense urban forest on a small island, surrounded by the infrastructure and movement of the modern metropolis, is one of the most striking aspects of North Brother Island's current landscape. The trees do not know or care that they are growing in the middle of New York City, or that the ground beneath their roots was once graded for hospital buildings, or that the brick walls their vines cover once housed patients sent there by the health department of a city that no longer maintains any connection to the island beyond holding title to it. They grow as trees grow, toward the light, downward through the soil, outward through whatever space is available, indifferent to human history, but shaped ultimately by the specific conditions that human history has created. The old brick buildings of the hospital complex are not fully hidden by the vegetation. They can be seen in aerial photographs, and from certain angles on the water, their outlines visible through and above the tree canopy. The largest structures are substantial enough to resist the vegetation's advance to the extent of remaining recognizable as buildings. Though their surfaces are extensively covered by vines, and their interiors are open to whatever plant life can establish itself in the conditions of light and moisture that the failing roofs and broken windows provide. In some places, trees have grown up inside former buildings, their trunks rising through collapsed floor sections toward the light, their canopies emerging from window openings or through gaps where roofs have partially failed. The grounds of the former hospital, the pathways between buildings, the former lawns, the areas that were once maintained as the appropriate surroundings for a working medical institution, are in various states of transformation. Some areas have developed dense thicket vegetation, nearly impenetrable to a person on foot. Others are more openly wooded, their ground cover a mixture of leaf litter and shade-tolerant plants. The former roadways that served the island's internal circulation are overgrown, but in some cases still traceable as slight depressions or as alignments of particularly persistent vegetation along their former routes. The shoreline of the island has also changed since the period of active use. Tidal action and the natural processes of shoreline adjustment have modified the island's edges in places. Storm events, including the significant flooding that accompanied major weather events affecting the New York metropolitan area in recent decades, have affected the low-lying portions of the island. The relationship between the island's land area and the surrounding river is not entirely static, and the island's physical boundaries have shifted to some degree over the decades since abandonment. What has emerged on North Brother Island over more than 60 years of ecological succession on disturbed urban land is something that landscape ecologists sometimes describe as a spontaneous urban woodland, a plant community that has assembled itself from the available pool of species capable of colonizing the specific conditions of this particular site, shaped by the underlying topography and soil conditions. By the influence of the surrounding river on temperature and moisture, and by the particular history of disturbance and abandonment that the site represents. It is not a pristine or natural woodland in any rigorous ecological sense. But it is a genuine and functioning ecosystem, and its existence in the middle of one of the world's great cities is, in its own way, remarkable. The ecological significance of North Brother Island extends beyond the vegetation that has established itself on the former hospital grounds. The island's combination of protected isolation, varied habitat, and location within a major flyway corridor has made it a site of genuine wildlife interest, particularly for birds, which have taken advantage of the island's undisturbed character in ways that have drawn the attention of ornithologists and conservation biologists. The most significant wildlife story associated with North Brother Island in recent decades has been its use as a nesting colony for black-crowned night herons, a species of medium-sized wading bird that breeds colonially in wooded areas near water. Black-crowned night herons, recognized by their stocky build, black cap and back, gray wings, and striking red eyes, are widespread across the Americas, but have experienced significant habitat pressures in urban and suburban environments as natural wetland and woodland breeding sites have been developed or disturbed. The undisturbed woodland and shoreline of North Brother Island has provided a relatively secure breeding location for a substantial colony of these birds, and the island has been documented as supporting one of the more significant black-crowned night heron colonies in the New York City area. The presence of this heron colony is one of the primary ecological reasons for the restrictions on public access to North Brother Island. The disturbance of nesting birds during the breeding season can significantly affect reproductive success. And the small geographic area of the island means that even limited human presence during the critical breeding period could have a measurable impact on the colony. The New York City Department of Parks and Recreation, which holds jurisdiction over the island, has cited the nesting colony as an important factor in the rationale for limiting access. Other bird species also use the island, taking advantage of the woodland habitat for nesting and the surrounding water and shoreline for foraging. The East River, despite its heavily urban character, supports populations of fish and other aquatic organisms that provide food resources for wading birds, diving birds, and raptors. The island's position within the Atlantic Flyway, the major migratory corridor running along the eastern coast of North America, means that it receives transient migratory birds in addition to its breeding residents. And the woodland habitat can be particularly attractive to songbirds during migration as a resting and foraging stop in an otherwise heavily developed urban landscape. The small mammals, reptiles, and other wildlife that may inhabit the island are less extensively documented than the bird population. Partly because they are less visible to the kinds of remote observation that are possible without landing on the island, and partly because systematic biological surveys of the island have not been conducted regularly. Raccoons, which are capable swimmers and highly adaptable urban mammals, may be present on the island. Various species of terrestrial invertebrates, insects, spiders, and other arthropods certainly inhabit the woodland and the decaying building structures, playing their essential roles in the decomposition of organic matter and in the food webs that sustain the higher animal life. The ecological story of North Brother Island is, in some respects, a story about what happens when urban land is removed from active human management and allowed to develop its own ecological character. This kind of spontaneous rewilding, the term is sometimes used loosely for situations like this. Though purists in the rewilding discourse would apply it more strictly, is not common in the densely developed landscape of New York City, where nearly every piece of land is either actively managed or under pressure for development. North Brother Island represents an unusual case in which the specific history of an urban site, its medical isolation, its institutional character, its eventual abandonment, has produced, inadvertently, an ecological refuge of some value within one of the most densely urbanized environments in the world. This is not a story that requires the language of the miraculous. The wildlife that uses North Brother Island is using it for practical reasons, because it offers habitat that is less disturbed than the alternatives available in the surrounding area, because the water around the island provides foraging resources, because the woodland canopy and the old buildings provide nesting sites. The birds do not know that they are nesting in an abandoned hospital. The herons do not know that the trees in which they build their platform nests were once the grounds of an institution where the city of New York confined its most controversial public health patient for more than 2 decades. They know only that this is a place where they can nest and feed and raise their young in relative peace, and that knowledge, for them, is entirely sufficient. There is a particular kind of attention that abandoned places attract in the modern world, an attention shaped by photography, by urban exploration, culture, by the internet's appetite for images of decay and desolation, and by the long tradition of associating places with histories of illness, deaths, and isolation with supernatural presence. North Brother Island has attracted exactly this kind of attention, and the images of the island that circulate most widely: the vine-covered brick facades, the collapsed ceilings, the long deteriorating corridors. The rusting beds in empty wards carry with them an atmosphere that popular culture readily interprets as haunted. It is worth examining this interpretation carefully, not to dismiss it entirely, but to understand what it actually consists of and where the boundary lies between the genuine historical atmosphere of a place and the overlay of supernatural narrative that popular culture sometimes applies to such places. The visual character of North Brother Island is undeniably evocative. The photographs taken by the relatively small number of people who have accessed the island legally, journalists, researchers, and photographers who have obtained the necessary permissions from the city, show a landscape of considerable atmospheric power. The old brick buildings of the former hospital, their walls draped in vines and their windows empty of glass, catch the light in ways that are genuinely striking. The long corridors, their floors covered with fallen plaster and leaf debris, their ceilings open in places to the sky above, create perspectives that are both architecturally interesting and emotionally resonant. The contrast between the evidence of former institutional purpose, a fireplace in a staff sitting room, the outline of a former nurse's station, the remnants of a tiled bathroom, and the natural processes that have been at work for decades, creates a visual poetry of abandonment that does not require supernatural interpretation to be powerful. The history of the place intensifies the atmosphere. A visitor who knows that these corridors once carried patients with infectious diseases, that this island was the involuntary home of Mary Mallon for more than 2 decades, that the shoreline nearby received the bodies of General Slocum victims on a June morning more than a century ago. Such a visitor brings to the visual experience a weight of historical association that deepens the emotional response to what is already a visually striking landscape. History and atmosphere reinforce each other, and the result can feel, to those who experience it, like something more than simply an interesting old building. But the leap from atmospheric and historically resonant to actively haunted is a significant one, and the evidence does not support it in any documentable way. There are stories of the kind that attach to any abandoned place with a history of death and suffering. Stories of sounds heard in empty corridors, of feelings of unease in particular rooms, of shadows glimpsed at the edges of perception. These stories are part of the folklore of the place, and like all folklore, they are worthy of attention as cultural artifacts, as evidence of how people process the emotional weight of difficult histories through the idiom of the supernatural. But they are not evidence of actual supernatural presence, and presenting them as such would be a disservice both to the genuine history of the island and to the people whose real lives and real suffering are at the center of that history. Mary Mallon did not become a ghost when she died on North Brother Island in 1938. She was a real woman whose real life ended there after more than 2 decades of involuntary confinement. A life that had been complicated, contested, and ultimately tragic in ways that do not require supernatural amplification to be deeply significant. The victims of the General Slocum disaster were real people, women, and children from a real immigrant community, who died in real ways in the East River and on the island's shores, and their memory is served not by ghost stories, but by accurate historical remembrance of who they were and what they lost. The island's reputation as a haunted or eerie place has sometimes attracted people who wish to access it without authorization. Urban explorers who are drawn by the combination of abandoned architecture and supernatural reputation, and who view the restricted access not as a legitimate protective measure, but as an obstacle to be circumvented. This is worth mentioning, not to moralize about it, but to note the practical consequences. The deteriorating buildings of North Brother Island are genuinely dangerous. Floors have collapsed, roofs are unstable, the structures have been weakening for decades without maintenance. The wildlife colony on the island, particularly the nesting herons, is genuinely sensitive to disturbance. The restricted access to the island is not maintained as a form of institutional secrecy or to hide anything from the public. It is maintained because the physical safety of visitors and the ecological integrity of the island are genuine concerns that unauthorized access would compromise. The most honest and respectful way to engage with North Brother Island, for those who find its history compelling, is through the documentary and historical record, through the work of historians, journalists, and researchers who have studied the island carefully and made their findings available. The island's history is fully remarkable without embellishment, and it speaks with its own voice to anyone who is willing to listen carefully to what it actually says. Popular accounts of North Brother Island sometimes contain claims that range from the somewhat exaggerated to the entirely unsupported. And it is worth taking some time to examine what the historical record actually tells us about the island and its history, and where popular narratives have diverged from the documented evidence. The claim that patients on North Brother Island were essentially imprisoned, treated purely as dangerous objects to be contained rather than as sick people receiving care, is a simplification that does not fully capture the complexity of the island's institutional history. Quarantine and isolation did involve elements of coercion, and the legal framework that permitted involuntary detention for public health purposes was genuinely problematic from a rights perspective. But the hospital on the island was staffed by medical professionals who were engaged in the genuine practice of medicine, and many patients were treated, recovered, and returned to their ordinary lives after relatively brief stays. The island was not uniformly or primarily a place of indefinite punitive confinement. It was primarily a hospital, with the particular complexity that some of its patients were held without their consent. The claim that Mary Mallon was personally responsible for dozens or hundreds of typhoid deaths is not supported by the historical evidence. The cases that SOPA attributed to Mallon numbered in the dozens over the course of her cooking career, and the deaths directly attributable to her carrier status are generally assessed by historians as a relatively small number. The attribution of specific typhoid cases to a specific carrier is itself a matter of epidemiological uncertainty. In the absence of the DNA fingerprinting and molecular epidemiology that modern outbreak investigations can employ. The connections between a carrier and specific cases rested on circumstantial evidence that was compelling but not always definitive. The claim that North Brother Island was deliberately hidden from New Yorkers or kept as a secret facility is not supported by the historical record. The island and its hospital were known to the city's health department, were reported on by newspapers at various points in its history, and were accessible to authorized visitors through the normal channels of a publicly operated institution. The island was not prominently featured in everyday public discourse, but this reflects the general tendency of institutional medical facilities to operate outside the daily awareness of most urban residents rather than any deliberate concealment. The claim that every building on the island remains standing and intact is incorrect. While some of the major brick structures remain standing in a deteriorated condition, the island has experienced significant structural loss over more than 6 decades of abandonment. Some buildings have partially or fully collapsed. Others have lost their roofs and significant portions of their interior structure. The island's built landscape is fragmentary, not preserved in anything approaching its original condition. The claim that Mary Mallon was the only typhoid carrier confined on North Brother Island, or that her confinement was universally considered appropriate by her contemporaries, is also incorrect. Other typhoid carriers were identified and managed by the New York City Health Department during this period, and the treatment of different carriers varied in ways that reflected both the specifics of individual cases and broader factors, including the carrier's compliance with health department directives. Their occupational exposure to vulnerable populations and other considerations. The management of Mary Mallon was more extreme than the management of other identified carriers, a disparity that was noticed and commented upon at the time. The General Slocum disaster, while less widely known than it deserves to be, has been thoroughly documented by historians, and the basic facts of the event, the number of passengers, the cause of the fire, the death toll, the legal aftermath, are well established. Popular accounts sometimes exaggerate the role of North Brother Island in the disaster's immediate response. The island was an important site of early rescue and recovery efforts, given its proximity to the burning vessel. But the response quickly extended across multiple locations along the East River shoreline and involved many organizations beyond the hospital's staff. The historical record of North Brother Island is rich and detailed enough to sustain serious interest without any need for embellishment. What the records tell us is the story of a real institution operating across a real stretch of time, serving a real public health function, staffed by real medical professionals, inhabited by real patients, whose experiences were varied and often difficult. Connected to real and significant events in the history of New York City and of American public health. This is a story worth knowing in its own right, and knowing it accurately is a form of respect for the people and the history it preserves. North Brother Island's history is, in one sense, a very specific and contained story about a particular 20-acre piece of land in the East River, and about the particular institution that operated there across several decades of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But in another sense, it is a story that opens outward into some of the most significant themes of New York City's history and of American history more broadly. The island's establishment as a quarantine and isolation facility reflected the specific challenges of managing public health in one of the world's largest and most rapidly growing cities at a time when the scientific understanding of infectious disease was undergoing its most significant transformation. The New York City that built and operated Riverside Hospital was a city of extraordinary cultural and demographic complexity, a city shaped by wave after wave of immigration, by the industrial economy that gave those immigrants their livelihood, by the political structures and reform movements and institutional developments that tried with varying degrees of success to manage the consequences of such rapid and concentrated growth. The diseases that North Brother Island was designed to manage were not merely biological phenomena. They were deeply entangled with the social conditions of immigrant urban life, the overcrowding that facilitated the transmission of airborne and contact infections, the inadequate water and sanitation infrastructure that allowed waterborne diseases to move through communities, the poverty that limited people's ability to seek medical care early or to rest and recover effectively from illness. Understanding the island's medical history requires understanding the social history of the communities from which its patients came. The Irish and German and Italian and Jewish and Eastern European immigrant communities that populated the neighborhoods of Lower Manhattan and the working-class districts of the outer boroughs, and that bore a disproportionate share of the infectious disease burden of the industrial city. The German American community of Kleindeutschland, whose losses in the General Slocum disaster were so catastrophic, represents one specific and vivid instance of this broader story of immigrant New York, the community that built St. Mark's Lutheran Church and organized the annual excursion that ended in tragedy was a community that had spent half a century building institutions, maintaining cultural traditions, raising families, and making a distinct contribution to the life of the city. The disaster that struck that community in June 1904 was not simply a maritime accident. It was an event that intersected with the specific social geography of immigrant New York, with the particular concentration of a specific community in a specific neighborhood, and with the specific cultural practice of the church excursion that brought so many people onto that particular vessel on that particular morning. Mary Mallon's story engages a different set of themes in New York's history: the experience of Irish immigrant women in domestic service, the expanding authority of progressive-era public health institutions, the legal and ethical questions surrounding the state's power to restrict individual liberty in the name of public health, and the role of the popular press in shaping public understanding of scientific concepts through sensationalized and often distorted narratives. The Typhoid Mary story is, at its core, a story about power, about who had it, how it was exercised, and what happened to individuals who fell within the reach of institutional authority in a legal and political environment that provided them with limited recourse. The history of North Brother Island also connects to the broader story of American environmental history, specifically to the history of what happens to urban land when the institutional or economic purposes that generated its development are no longer operative. The island is not unique in having been abandoned and allowed to undergo ecological succession, but it is unusual in the completeness and the duration of its abandonment within such a densely developed urban context. The spontaneous woodland that has established itself on the former hospital grounds represents, in ecological terms, a small example of the resilience of biological systems, the capacity of living things to colonize and transform even heavily disturbed landscapes when the disturbance is removed. This is a story that resonates beyond North Brother Island, connecting to broader questions about the relationship between urban development, ecological function, and the long-term management of land in densely populated regions. Finally, the island's story connects to questions about memory, commemoration, and how cities relate to their own histories. New York City is a place of extraordinary historical depth, but also a place where the pressure of the present, the relentless demand for new development, new activity, new use of every available space, can work against the preservation of historical memory. North Brother Island has been preserved, in a sense, not by deliberate commemorative effort, but by the practical circumstances of its situation. The restricted access, the ecological concerns, the absence of any obvious immediate use for the island that would drive its redevelopment. But this preservation is passive rather than active, and the island carries no formal memorial, no interpretive signage, no organized historical presentation that would help visitors understand what they are looking at and why it matters. The question of whether and how North Brother Island should be commemorated is one that has been discussed at various points without resolution. Some historians and preservationists have advocated for some form of public access and interpretation, a way of making the island's history accessible to New Yorkers and visitors who might find it significant and meaningful. Others have argued that the ecological values of the island, particularly the nesting bird colony, are best protected by maintaining restricted access. This is a genuine tension without an obvious resolution, and it reflects the broader challenge of managing places where historical significance and ecological value exist in the same space and do not always point toward the same management decisions. Let us think carefully for a moment about what remains of North Brother Island's history, not just the physical remains on the island itself, but the full range of things that persist from the decades of the island's active use in different forms and in different places. The physical remains on the island are the most visible: the deteriorating brick buildings, the overgrown grounds, the broken infrastructure of a former institutional complex. These physical remains are diminishing over time, as the processes of natural deterioration continue without intervention, and the buildings that are standing now will not all be standing in another half-century without significant conservation effort. Whether such effort will be made is uncertain. The physical remains on the island are, in this sense, finite, a resource that is being consumed by time, and that will eventually be largely gone. But the historical record that documents the island's history is not diminishing in the same way. The archives of the New York City Department of Health, the records of the courts that heard the habeas corpus petitions filed on Mary Mallon's behalf, the newspaper archives that covered the General Slocum disaster, and the Typhoid Mary story, the hospital records that documented patients and staff. The personal papers of physicians and public health officials who worked in this period. These are documentary resources that preserve the history of North Brother Island in ways that do not depend on the survival of the physical structures on the island itself. The historical scholarship that has been built on these documentary resources is also a form of preservation. Historians who have studied the island's history, among them Judith Walser-Leavitt, whose book on Mary Mallon remains one of the most careful and thoughtful treatments of that story. The various historians who have written about the General Slocum disaster. The urban historians who have placed the island in the context of New York City's public health history have produced a body of work that makes the island's history accessible to readers who will never visit the island and who may never have occasion to examine the primary sources directly. The memory carried by the descendants of people who were connected to the island's history is another form of persistence. The families of General Slocum victims have maintained the memory of the disaster across generations through the annual commemorations at the monument in Tompkins Square Park, through family stories, through the genealogical and historical research that many descendants have undertaken. The descendants of patients who were treated or confined at Riverside Hospital carry whatever family knowledge was transmitted about those experiences, though in many cases this knowledge may have faded or been lost across the generations. What remains is also something less tangible than documents or physical structures, a kind of historical significance, a place in the story of the city and the nation that does not depend on any particular physical or documentary artifact for its persistence. North Brother Island matters as a piece of American history, not because of what it looks like now or because of what any specific document says about it, but because of what happened there and what that history reveals about the society that produced it. This kind of significance does not deteriorate with the brickwork or fade with the documentary record. It persists as long as people find the history worth engaging with and worth passing on. From the shores of North Brother Island, on a clear day, the view across the East River encompasses one of the most dramatic urban landscapes in the world. To the south and west, the towers of Midtown and Lower Manhattan rise above the river, their scale compressed by distance into a dense, glittering array that represents the accumulated result of more than 3 centuries of urban development on the island of Manhattan. The bridges that span the river, the Triborough, the Queensboro, the Williamsburg and Brooklyn bridges visible in the farther distance, arc over the water in their various configurations, carrying the traffic that sustains the daily function of the metropolitan area. The planes descending toward LaGuardia cross the sky to the south at regular intervals, Their flight paths a reminder of the density of movement that characterizes this corner of the world. The city that surrounds North Brother Island today is very different from the city that established Riverside Hospital in 1885, and very different again from the city that was mourning the General Slocum victims in 1904, or managing the controversy of Mary Mallon's confinement in the years between 1907 and 1910. The physical scale of the city has grown enormously. The population has changed in its composition, reflecting the successive waves of immigration that have continued to shape New York across the 20th century and into the 21st. The public health infrastructure that was being built during the island's active years, the water systems, the sewage treatment, the disease surveillance and response capacity, the hospital system, has developed into something vastly more sophisticated and comprehensive than anything that existed when the island was first pressed into medical service. The diseases that drove the island's establishment are largely, though not entirely, managed today through mechanisms that were only beginning to be developed during the island's active years. Smallpox has been globally eradicated. Typhoid fever, while still present in parts of the world where water and sanitation infrastructure is inadequate, is rare in New York City and treatable with antibiotics when it occurs. Diphtheria and scarlet fever are managed through vaccination and antibiotic treatment. Tuberculosis, while not fully defeated, is treated with antibiotic regimens that did not exist when the island was in active use. The specific public health crisis that North Brother Island was built to address has been transformed, though not entirely resolved, by the very scientific and institutional developments that were still in their early stages during the island's most active years. And yet the underlying questions that the island's history raises about the relationship between public health authority and individual rights, about the obligations of society to people who are ill or who pose risks to the health of others, about the social conditions that generate infectious disease and the social dimensions of any adequate response to it. These questions have not been resolved. They recur in different forms in every era, whenever a new infectious disease emergency requires society to make decisions about quarantine, isolation, surveillance, and the balance between individual liberty and collective protection. The specific answers vary with the specific circumstances, with the nature of the disease, the state of medical knowledge, the legal and political frameworks in place, and the social and cultural context in which decisions are being made. But the underlying tension between individual rights and public health authority that animated the debates about quarantine on North Brother Island in the early 20th century is a permanent feature of how democratic societies manage infectious disease. The city across the water from North Brother Island continues to generate these questions as it has always done, because it is a city of millions of people living in close proximity, sharing air and water and public space, vulnerable to the same biological agents that have always threatened concentrated human populations. The institutions that manage these risks today are more sophisticated than Riverside Hospital. The legal frameworks that govern their authority are more developed than those that applied to Mary Mallon's confinement, and the medical tools available to them are incomparably more powerful than anything available in 1885 or 1907. But the fundamental challenge of protecting the health of a large, dense, diverse urban population against biological threats that do not respect individual autonomy or social boundaries remains and will remain one of the central ongoing tasks of the city across the water. North Brother Island stands in relation to that city as a historical marker, a place where one particular chapter of the ongoing story of urban public health was lived out at some cost to the individuals involved, and with consequences that extended across several decades and that touched many lives. The island is quiet now, its trees growing slowly in the river breeze, its old buildings yielding gradually to the patient work of time and weather. But the city beyond it continues, carrying within its daily movement all the questions and challenges that the island's history illuminates, and continuing to generate in its density and its diversity and its complexity the conditions that will require future generations to find their own answers to questions that have never been fully resolved. Let us end where we began, on the water, in the East River, in the vicinity of a small island that most of the city around it has never visited and perhaps never thought much about. Imagine the island at night in the summer. The city's lights are visible in every direction. The towers of Manhattan illuminated against the dark sky to the south and west, the scattered lights of the Bronx shoreline to the north and east, the distant glow of Queens and LaGuardia to the south, and overhead the occasional flashing lights of aircraft in descent. The river reflects all of this light in broken, moving patterns, the currents and small waves of the tidal strait catching and scattering the illumination of the surrounding city into something that is not quite stillness and not quite motion, but something between. On the island itself, in this imagined nighttime view, there is darkness. The trees that cover most of the former hospital grounds absorb the ambient light of the city, their canopies forming a dark mass that stands in contrast to the illuminated water around it. The shapes of the old brick buildings are barely visible within and above the tree canopy, darker rectangles against the dark sky, their outlines softened by the vines that cover them and by the trees that have grown up around them. The herons that nest in the woodland are quiet at night, settled into their roost positions in the tree canopy, their distinctive hunched shapes visible only to someone in the trees among them. The water birds that use the island's shoreline for foraging have moved to their own resting places. The sounds of the river at night are different from the sounds of the river during the day. Less traffic, quieter engine sounds from the occasional vessel crossing the water, the lapping of small waves against the island's eroded shoreline, and from somewhere in the darkness of the woodland, the occasional sound of wind moving through the branches of trees that have been growing here for more than 60 years. This is the island as it exists now, not as a place of institutional activity, not as a place of medical management and public health authority, not as a place of confinement or of recovery or of tragedy, but as a place that has moved beyond all of those things while remaining in its physical fabric, and in its location in the East River, the same specific piece of earth where all of those things happened. Mary Mallon lies in St. Raymond's Cemetery in the Bronx, in the city that both employed her and confined her, the city that made her famous under a name she did not choose, that held her on this island for more than 2 decades, and that buried her finally in its own ground. The passengers of the General Slocum lie in various cemeteries across the metropolitan area, remembered in the stone monument in Tompkins Square Park, and in the family memories of the descendants of the Kleindeutschland community that was so devastated by that June morning in 1904. The doctors and nurses and attendants who worked on North Brother Island through its decades of active use lie in their own grave, largely anonymous now, their daily acts of medical care unrecorded in any surviving document. And the patients, the thousands of people who were brought to this island across its decades of Operation Sick, or simply suspected of being infectious, separated from their families and their ordinary lives by the action of a public health system that was doing its best to manage an extraordinary challenge. The patients are the least visible in any historical account, because institutional records capture illness and admission and discharge, but not the full texture of human experience. What they felt, what they hoped for, what they missed about the city visible across the water, belongs to the interior life of individuals whose inner experiences were not preserved. But they were here. They were real people, immigrants and native-born New Yorkers, men and women and children, people with names and families and histories and plans for futures that illness and quarantine had interrupted. They lay in the hospital wards of this island, watching the light move across the ceiling, listening to the sound of the river, waiting for recovery or for the declaration that they were no longer considered a danger to others and could return to the city they could see from the island's shore. Their presence here, their real, physical, human presence in this place, is part of what the island carries, invisibly but permanently, in its history. The East River does not keep these memories. The water moves through the tidal strait as it has always moved, in both directions, depending on the state of the tide, carrying whatever the river carries, dissolved minerals from the distant watershed, the biological material of a living aquatic ecosystem, the warmth of summer and the cold of winter in their alternating seasons, and the reflected light of the city that has grown up around it over the centuries. The river does not remember, rivers do not remember, but we can. The history of North Brother Island is a history of medicine and of illness, of authority and of resistance, of tragedy and of ordinary daily life conducted in an extraordinary setting. It is a history of people making decisions, some wise, some questionable, some clearly unjust, under conditions of genuine uncertainty, with imperfect knowledge and imperfect tools, trying to manage a set of problems that had no perfect solutions. It is a history of a city grappling with the consequences of its own extraordinary growth, building institutions to manage those consequences, and gradually, not always smoothly, not always justly, but persistently, developing better understanding and better tools for protecting the health of its people. The island sits in the river, covered in its spontaneous woodland, its old buildings continuing their slow return to the earth. The herons nest in the treetops in spring, indifferent to the human history that gave them their undisturbed habitat. The tides move in and out around the island's shores, as they have moved since long before any human being built anything on this particular piece of river land. And across the water, the city continues, as vast and dense and complicated and alive as it has ever been, carrying within its daily movement the accumulated history of all the people and all the institutions and all the decisions, wise and unwise, that have made it what it is. Somewhere in that daily movement, the history of North Brother Island continues too, in the descendants of patients who were once brought here by boat, in the families of General Slocum victims who return each year to the Tompkins Square Monument, in the historians and researchers and writers who have found this history worth preserving and worth understanding. The island is quiet, the river moves, the city glows in the darkness beyond the water. And the history, held in documents, engraved in family memory, in the slow deterioration of old brick walls, and in the patient growth of trees over ground where people once lived and worked and suffered and recovered and died, the history remains. Good night.